We're studying the incredible atrocities of Antiochus Epiphanes today and the epic rise of the Maccabees. So stay tuned. All right, we'll be live streaming these lessons to YouTube and also to Sermon Audio. On Sermon Audio, there are over 100 other Bible studies that you can get a hold of mine. Also, Friday mornings on Final Fight Bible Radio at 8 o'clock a.m. and also 8 o'clock p.m. Pacific time. I play my Bible studies and lessons. You can get more information there. Also, we're doing Final Fight Bible Radio live on Fridays at 9 o'clock a.m. And those episodes are available to re-listen to on FFBR Premium at any time. If you enjoy this content, share it with your friends and families. Hit the subscribe button on the YouTube bar there. And if you're interested in additional in-depth studies, I have 4 books that I've published through Final Fight Bible Radio that you can get a hold of and get some in-depth information that pertains to some of this and what we'll be getting into here in a week or two. And if you would like to support myself or the ministry of Final Fight Bible Radio, you can do so through the FFBR app or website or the donation links on YouTube or Sermon Audio. Thank you for those of you that do contribute. I really appreciate it. All right, so last week we went over Antiochus Epiphanes' second attack on Egypt and also his second attack on Jerusalem. And Antiochus' second attack on Egypt was thwarted, if you remember, by Roman intervention, which humiliated Antiochus Epiphanes, or as the Bible says, it grieved him in Daniel 11, verse 30, and he took his anger and his rage out on the Jewish people there at Jerusalem. And so Antiochus' second attack on Jerusalem was when he massacred tens of thousands of Jews, made the Jewish laws, the customs, the traditions, he made all of those things illegal, and it was at that second attack on Jerusalem where Antiochus Epiphanes set up the idol of Zeus on top of the brazen altar, and then began to offer in sacrifice to Zeus swine's flesh on the brazen altar. And this event is obviously a significant event in Jewish history, and so it makes perfect sense that these things would be cataloged somewhere in the Bible, and that's what we have here in Daniel chapter 11. We are very much still dealing with past history, and this is what Daniel 11:31 was talking about. It says, "And arms," or armies, "shall stand on his part," Antiochus Epiphanes' part, "and they shall pollute," or defile, "the sanctuary of strength." Now you remember last week, the sanctuary of strength, God is the strength of Israel, so the sanctuary of strength is the temple of God. They defile the temple of God and shall take away the daily sacrifice. They did that by making the daily sacrifice illegal. Furthermore, you can't, well anyway, they made it illegal. "And they shall place the abomination," or the idol, "that maketh desolate." All right? So as I pointed out last week, the fact that Antiochus for Epiphanes fulfilled this abomination of desolation event doesn't take away from or negate the fact that the Antichrist will also perform an abomination of desolation event in the future. All right? They are both involved, and they are both involved with a prophesied abomination of desolation, Antiochus Epiphanes and the Antichrist. It's just that the abomination of desolation event spoken of in Daniel chapter 11 is referring to what Antiochus for Epiphanes did. And the abomination of desolation event spoken of in Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 12, and Matthew chapter 24, and also Mark chapter 13, I believe. Yes, Mark 13. It's a parallel passage of Matthew 24. Anyway, Daniel 8, Daniel 12, Matthew 24, those abomination of desolation events are still future and have to do with what the Antichrist is going to do. So what Antiochus Epiphanes did is a type or a picture of what the Antichrist will do. All right? It's not that hard. So furthermore, for those people that like to insist that verses 23, 20, 22, 21, all these things that we're reading about right now are future prophecy and pertain to the Antichrist, just keep in mind that if you do that, then this abomination of desolation event in Daniel 11:31, if you're going to make that the Antichrist, then what that means is you have zero reference in the entire Bible to what Antiochus Epiphanes did, okay? So if you're going to make Daniel 11 the Antichrist, all the other abomination of desolation events are Antichrist also, and basically you've just eliminated the single reference to Antiochus Epiphanes and what he did in the Bible. Now, if you want to go that route, you can. You can get off the historical highway early if you want, but like I said, you're going to be having all kinds of issues and problems if you do that. So we're still on the historical highway as far as I'm concerned. So, all right, I want to focus real quick on this phrase, the abomination that maketh desolate. All right, the word abomination in the Bible can refer to a wicked action, or it can refer to a wicked thing, namely an idol. The word abomination throughout the Old Testament is often a reference or synonymous with an idol. And seeing as how this abomination in verse 31 is something that is placed or set up, it's obviously referring to an idol that's being set up in the verse. It's an idol that's being placed, all right? So the word desolate is a word in the Bible that means empty or devoid of inhabitants, okay? And so this idol, in verse 31, it said, they shall place the abomination, this idol, that maketh desolate. What's doing the desolate? What's making what desolate? The idol is making something desolate. It's making something empty. But what did an idol make empty? How could an inanimate object, like an idol, make something empty? Did the idol make Jerusalem empty? Well, the people of Jerusalem did flee the city, but the idol didn't do that. Antiochus Epiphanes did that. And in verse 31, it says it's this idol, this abomination that makes desolate. And the abomination is referencing an idol. So how did an idol make something desolate? What did the idol specifically make desolate? Okay, so that's kind of the question. And the only answer that makes sense is the temple was made desolate. In other words, the idol of Zeus made the temple of God desolate. That is to say, God's presence left the temple when Antiochus placed the idol on the altar. Now, that's not to say that Antiochus Epiphanes defeated God, or that God was powerless to stop Antiochus, or that God had to retreat from Antiochus and his idol, and God had to flee out of the temple. That's not what I'm saying. No, this defilement of the temple was allowed by God, and was a judgment against the Jewish people for their own national defilement, and for their own defilement of their own temple. Because the condition of the temple was a sign to the Jews. The physical condition of the temple was a reflection of their spiritual condition. Yes, Antiochus defiled the temple, but Menelaus, remember, had already defiled the temple by taking over the priesthood, and he was a Benjaminite. He wasn't even a Levite. Furthermore, Jewish society was completely defiled with the adoption of the Greek customs and traditions and ways. So, simply put, the Lord had had enough, and Antiochus is simply the rod that God is using to chasten Israel for their sins at this time. And God had decided to vacate his temple for a time, and the moment that his Holy Spirit departed from the temple, evidently, according to Daniel 11:31, is the moment when Antiochus Epiphanes set up this idol on the brazen altar. So in that respect, you could say that the idol made the temple desolate. You say, well, I just don't know if I believe that. I know it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around, but I'm just trying to interpret verse 31 as literal as possible. It says, the abomination that maketh desolate. The abomination made something desolate. What? The idol. The temple. The idol made the temple desolate. Okay? So God left the temple when the idol was set up. All right? Now, God had left the temple of Jerusalem once before. Now, understand this. Back in Jeremiah's day, now this was Jeremiah's day, you're going back 200 years in history or actually more like 400 years almost in history from where we're at right now. But Jeremiah one time was complaining to the Lord about the prosperity of the wicked and asking why things were so bad. And this is what God had to tell him. In Jeremiah chapter 12, verse 7, God told Jeremiah back in Jeremiah's day, I have forsaken mine house. I have left mine heritage. I have given the dearly beloved of my soul into the hand of her enemies. Okay, so God had forsaken the house once before, which is exactly what God said he would do if the Jews forsook him. Okay, it's not that God is capricious and is just abandoning his people or anything like that. It's that God had told the Jews, if you forsake me, I'll forsake you. That's just the way it goes in the Old Testament. 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 6. Go ahead and turn there if you have time. It says, but if ye shall at all turn from following me, this is God speaking to the Jews, or ye or your children, and will not keep my commandments and my statutes which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, Then will I cut off Israel out of the land which I have given them, and this house, speaking to Solomon, God is speaking to Solomon at the time when this temple is being built and dedicated. God tells Solomon that this house, this temple, which I have hallowed for my name, will I cast out of my sight, and Israel shall be a proverb and a byword among all people. And this house, and at this house, which is high, every one that passeth by it shall be astonished and shall hiss. And they shall say, Why hath the Lord done thus unto this land and to this house? What happened? And they shall answer, Because they forsook the Lord their God, who brought forth their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and have taken hold upon other gods, and have worshipped them and served them. Therefore hath the Lord brought upon them all this evil. So God forsook the temple, and the temple became desolate of God's presence due to the sins of Israel back in the days of Jeremiah. And this first time around, God used Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, as his rod. Now, this second time around, what we're talking about, God departs from the temple again, and the temple is made desolate again, and this time God sends Antiochus Epiphanes as his rod. Now, interestingly enough, the Bible tells us what the last straw was for God what the last straw was for God before Nebuchadnezzar was sent to destroy the temple. The Bible tells us, this is it. God is finally done, and Nebuchadnezzar is now commissioned to destroy the temple. In Jeremiah chapter 15, verse 1, I'll read it for you. It says, Then the Lord said unto me, this is Jeremiah, Though Moses and Samuel stood before me, yet my mind could not be toward this people. Cast them out of my sight, and let them go forth. Now that's quite a statement. Now what I'm talking about here is just this concept that God can forsake his house, as we clearly see that he did in Jeremiah's day, and essentially the same thing is happening in this intertestamental time. So it's happened before, so there's no reason why it couldn't happen again. And that's what I'm arguing. It did happen again during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. But in Jeremiah's day, we have it laid out and spelled out, and God says that even if Moses and Samuel were here, my mind couldn't be towards this people. And in Jeremiah 15, verse 4, God goes on to say, he says, I will cause them to be removed, the Jews, into all kingdoms of the earth. Why? Because of King Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah, king of Judah, for that which he did in Jerusalem. Now, why is God so angry with the Jews that he was going to send them to Babylon and depart from his temple? Well, it was because of something Manasseh did. What did Manasseh do? Well, go ahead and look at 2 Kings chapter 21. This one's interesting. So the last straw for God was what Manasseh did. And let's see what Manasseh did that made God so angry to depart from his house. 2 Kings 21, verse 1. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and reigned 55 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Hephzibah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, after the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. For he built up again the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed, and he reared up altars for Baal, and made a grove, as did Ahab, king of Israel, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served them. Okay, so Manasseh was an idolater. But then it says this. There was a lot of kings that were idolaters, but for some reason, Manasseh did something that caused God to vacate the house. Look at verse 4. And he, Manasseh, built altars in the house of the Lord, which the Lord had said, In Jerusalem will I put my name. And he built altars for all the host of heaven, like Jupiter, or Zeus, if you will, in the two courts of the house of the Lord. And he made his son pass or die through the fire, and observed times, and used enchantments, and dealt with familiar spirits and wizards. He wrought much wickedness in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. Verse 7, And he, Manasseh, set a graven image, an abomination, an idol, of the grove that he had made, in the house. Manasseh set an abomination in God's house, in God's temple, and for that transgression, the temple and Jerusalem were made desolate. It happened in Jeremiah's day, and it's happening again here. So Antiochus Epiphanes didn't drive God out of the temple. God was already disgusted by his people and by what was going on at the temple, and so he was already packing his bags, if you will, and God punctuated his departure by allowing Antiochus to set up an idol of Zeus on the brazen altar. God's not all upset about this because God is allowing this. This is what God is allowing to happen, if you will, as a chastisement to his own people for their own wickedness. All right, it's kind of like God spitting as he's leaving and saying, do whatever you want, Antiochus. Go ahead and call this house the temple of Zeus. I don't care because I'm out of here. It's kind of like that. So back to Daniel chapter 11. And in Daniel chapter 11, verse 31, it says, and arms, or we've already gone over this, but real quick, and arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination or the idol that maketh desolate, and maketh the temple desolate. All right, verse 32, and such, and this is referring to Jews, as do wickedly against the covenant, the Jewish covenant, or the religion of the Jews, if you will, shall he, Antiochus Epiphanes, corrupt by flatteries. All right, so basically Antiochus, at this time in history, would spare the lives of any Jews who rejected Judaism and followed the religion and the idolatry of the Greeks. Also, some of those Jews who were eager to covet and persecute, some of those Jews who were eager to convert, that's what I should say, and persecute their own people, Antiochus exalted to places of great wealth, power, and authority, much like what the Nazis did for George Soros back in World War II. All right? The verse goes on to say, but the people, the Jews, that do know their God, in other words, the ones who are faithful to God, shall be strong and do exploits, or they'll do incredible deeds. So in spite of the, whoa, hold on. There we go. I don't know what happened there. So in spite of the societal apostasy in Israel that eventually resulted in this national chastisement, there were still many individuals and families who stayed faithful to God, the Mosaic Law, and the Abrahamic Covenant. And these were the Jews who did know their God, as the Bible says, and were strong. Now, something to point out here real quick. All of those who knew their God, all of those Jews at this time who knew their God and were faithful to the Mosaic Law, they were strong, but not all of those who knew their God did exploits. That is, incredible deeds. That is to say, only some of the godly people at this time did exploits. They were all strong, but not all of them did exploits. Okay, those strong and exploits are not necessarily the same thing. And I say this because there were a lot of strong Jews who were tortured and killed, and they didn't do any exploits. Their strength was not physical strength, it's spiritual strength. The strength in the verse is referring to spiritual strength, and the exploits in the verse are physical, but the strength in the verse is spiritual. So you have it like this, essentially the people that, let's see, here we go. The people that do know their God, that were faithful to God, shall be spiritually strong and do physical exploits or incredible deeds. All right, I just have to point that out right there. Something's wrong with that button. All right, so allow me to give you a few examples of the spiritual strength of some of these godly Jews that were living through this horrific time period. So you have Eleazar, and some of these accounts are given in the book of 2 Maccabees. But Eleazar was basically an old man in Jerusalem, and he was recognized for and respected for his lifetime of godliness and faithfulness to the Lord. And when Antiochus took the city, he required that the Jews demonstrate their renouncement of their religion by eating swine's flesh offered on the brazen altar to the idol of Zeus. And this, of course, was abominable to the Jews for a number of reasons. Obviously, this is an idol on the brazen altar. That's an abomination in and of itself. But also, the Jews were commanded not to eat swine's flesh. It was to be an abomination to them. Okay, that's Leviticus 11, Deuteronomy 14. So when Eleazar, this old man, was apprehended and brought before the altar, it was now his turn to submit to Antiochus or die. And they forced swine's meat into his mouth, but Eleazar spit it out. And at this moment, there was Jews, young men that were standing by who had joined Antiochus. They had already eaten the swine's flesh, and they're on his side. And they were now commissioned to help in the defilement of other Jews. And when they saw Eleazar spit this, bacon out of his mouth, and they knew that this old man was going to be killed, but they respected this old man. Everybody knew who Eleazar was, and these Jews were like, they took him aside and they said, listen, we'll make a deal with you, Eleazar. It'll be fine. You don't have to be killed. We don't want you to be killed. What we can do is we'll see to it that, we can have a lamb offered on the altar, and you can go ahead and eat lamb's meat and just pretend that it's the swine's flesh, but it'll actually be lamb's meat. That way you don't have to defile yourself, and that way you don't have to be killed. They're trying to help him out. They're trying to give him this alternative. But here was Eleazar's response. Now, real quick, before I read you this response, what would you do if you were in that situation? You can either eat the bacon and defile yourself and go against the word of God, or you can be killed, or you have this third option now where you can have everybody kind of go through the motions and pretend like they're sacrificed, like you're eating swine's flesh, but in reality it's lamb, so it's okay technically, and that way you can survive. What would you do? Well, here's what Eleazar did. It says, "But he began to consider discreetly, and as became of his age, and the excellency of his ancient years, and the honor of his gray head whereon was come, he answered accordingly, and willed them straightway to send him to the grave. For it becometh not our age, said he, in any wise to dissemble." In other words, it's not becoming for an old man like myself to be a faker and to just put on a show. And he says, it becometh not our age in any wise to dissemble, whereby many young persons might think that I, Eleazar, being 80 years old and 90 years old, were now gone to a strange religion. And so these young men, through my hypocrisy and desire to live a little time and a moment longer, should be deceived by me, and I get a stain to my old age and make it abominable. Wherefore now, manfully changing this life, I will show myself such an one as mine age requireth, and leave a notable example to such as be young to die willingly and courageously for the honorable and holy laws. And when he had said these words, immediately he was put to the torment, and thus this man died, leaving his death for an example of noble courage and a memorial of virtue, not only to young men, but unto all his nation. All right, so that's one of the strong Jews. There's another incredible story of this Jewish mother and her 7 sons. Now, this particular account is one of the most incredible persecution accounts I have ever read in my life. And some say that this account was made up, or it was invented as a metaphor to encapsulate the Jewish mindset of resistance. But I don't believe that. I think that the author of the historical document called 2nd Maccabees knew of a lot of different persecution stories, and he probably could have written a book as thick as Fox's Book of Martyrs or Martyr's Mirror on what had happened, but he only wrote a short essay, essentially, of what had happened, a short historical document of what happened, and so he had to pick and choose which stories were the most notable, and so this particular story was so remarkable that he chose it over a lot of the other stories. And besides, that's what I would do if I was living in those days, living in proximity to those events. I'd find the most remarkable stories and record those ones. So I believe what I'm about to tell you really happened. And even if the scholars say that they think it was just a metaphor, I could care less what the scholars say. If you read the account, just read the account for yourself. I think you'll be convinced. Anyway, I'll set the scene with 2 Maccabees 7 verse 1. It says, "And it came to pass also that 7 brethren with their mother were taken, and compelled by King Antiochus Epiphanes against the Mosaic law to taste swine's flesh, and were tormented with scourges and whips." All right, so initially they refused, and then they're repeatedly beaten and whipped, and they're told to eat the swine's flesh or else. So it says, "But one of them that spake first said thus, What wouldest thou ask or learn of us? We are ready to die rather than to transgress the laws of our fathers. Then the king, being in a rage, commanded pans and cauldrons to be made hot, which forthwith being heated, he commanded to cut out the tongue of him that spake first, and to cut off the uttermost parts of his body, the rest of his brethren and his mother looking on." So they start cutting off his fingers and his toes one by one. And as anyone knows, the number one motivation for getting a person to do something is to injure or threaten injury to your child or a loved one, okay? You can boast all you want about your devotion of God, but the truth is, none of us really know what we would do if our kid was being tortured in front of us, all right? Deep down, we're probably all pretty fearful of what we would do. And I think that deep down, most of us know that our children are the limits of our resistance. And generally speaking, everyone will do anything to save their children or to save their loved ones. because that's natural, that's normal, that's a good thing. But God's Spirit can in extreme situations give us the strength to do the supernatural, and how this family responds to this persecution is truly a supernatural feat of spiritual strength. In verse 5 of 2 Maccabees chapter 7, it says, "Now when he was thus maimed in all his members, he, Antiochus, commanded him, being yet alive, to be brought to the fire and to be fried in the pan," which they did. They throw him in the pan, and he starts burning alive. "And as the vapor of the pan was for a good space dispersed, the family exhorted one another with the mother to die manfully. So when the first was dead after this number, they brought the second of the 7 sons to make him a mocking stock. And when the Seleucids had pulled off the skin of his head with his hair, they asked him, 'Wilt thou eat before thou be punished throughout every member of thy body?' But he answered in his own language and said, 'No,' in his own language, which maybe in Hebrew is like mamash lo, which means heck no. All right. Wherefore he also received the next torment in order, as the former did." So one by one, these 7 brothers are horrifically tortured and killed before their mother, each one giving an inspiring short speech prior to their death, and each one of them refused to submit to the king. They refused to submit to the king. They weren't so naive as to think that Romans 13 gave blanket authority to rulers and that everyone has to submit to them regardless. Now, of course, I say that tongue-in-cheek, knowing that Romans 13 was not written yet. Nevertheless, the Jews at this time in history had a lot more sense than a lot of Christians do these days. You know, you have to take the poison death shot if the government says so. If the government mandates it, you have to take it if you're a Christian. These Jews had a lot more sense than a lot of Christians do these days. So how did the mother take all of this? Seeing her boys one by one mutilated and killed and tortured right in front of her. What did she do? Well, verse 20, it says, "But the mother was marvelous above all and worthy of honorable memory. For when she saw her 7 sons slain within the space of 1 day, she bare it with a good courage, because the hope that she had in the Lord. Yea, she exhorted every one of them, every one of her boys, in her own language. She said unto them, I cannot tell how ye came into my womb. For I neither gave you breath nor life, neither was it I that formed the members of every one of you. But doubtless the Creator of the world, who formed the generation of man and found out the beginning of all things, will also of his own mercy give you breath and life again, as ye now regard not your own selves for the law's sake." So bear in mind that while she's speaking, Antiochus is standing by, and he can't understand what she's saying to them because she's speaking in Hebrew. It says, "Now Antiochus, thinking himself despised and suspecting it to be a reproachful speech, while the youngest was yet alive, did not only exhort him, the youngest, by words, but also assured him with oaths." So now he's down to the last of the 7 kids. It's the youngest kid right in front of him. And Antiochus tells him that he would make him both rich and a happy man if he would turn from the laws of his fathers. That also he would take him for his friend, and he would trust him with his affairs. Remember what Daniel 11:32 said? It said, "And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he, Antiochus, corrupt by flatteries." All right, so Antiochus made these kind of offers to a lot of Jews, and some of the Jews did take him up on the offer. But here's what happens with this young man in his situation. "But when the young man would in no case hearken unto Antiochus, the king called his mother," the young man's mother, "and exhorted her that she would counsel the young man to save his life." He's like, "Lady, tell your kid just to take my offer. This is ridiculous." And when he had exhorted her with many words, she promised him that she would counsel her son. She says, "Don't worry, Antiochus, I'll talk to him." But she, bowing herself toward him, laughing the cruel tyrant to scorn, spake in her own language on this manner. So she's speaking in Hebrew. "O my son, have pity upon me that bare thee 9 months in my womb, and nourished thee, and brought thee up unto this age, and endured the troubles of education. I had to educate you and do all this stuff. Have mercy on me, have pity on me, son. I beseech thee, my son, look upon the heaven and the earth and all that is therein, and consider that God made them of things that were not, and so was mankind made likewise. Fear not this tormentor, but being worthy of thy brethren, take thy death, that I may receive thee again in mercy with thy brethren. While she was yet speaking these words, the young man said, Whom wait ye for? I will not obey the king's commandment, but I will obey the commandment of the law that was given unto our fathers by Moses. And thou, that hast been the author of all this mischief against the Hebrews," he's speaking to Antiochus now, putting his finger in his face, says, you shall not escape the hands of God. For we, the Jews, suffer because of our sins. And though the living Lord be angry with us for a little while, for our chastening and correction, yet shall he be at one again with his servants. But thou, O godless man, of all others most wicked, be not lifted up without a cause, nor puffed up with uncertain hopes, lifting up thy hand against the servants of God. For thou hast not yet escaped the judgment of the Almighty God, who seest all things. For our brethren, who now have suffered a short pain, are dead under God's covenant of everlasting life. But thou, through the judgment of God, shall receive just punishment for thy pride. But I, as my brethren, offer up my body and life for the laws of our fathers, beseeching God that he would speedily be merciful unto our nation. And his other prayer is that thou by torments and plagues mayest confess that he alone is God. Now remember that, because that's going to be important for the next lesson. And that in me and in my brethren the wrath of the Almighty, which is justly brought upon our nation, may cease. Then the king, being in a rage, handled him worse than all the rest, and took it grievously that he was mocked. So this man died undefiled, and put his whole trust in the Lord. Last of all also, the mother of the son, last of all, after the sons, the mother died. All right, and then the author of 2 Maccabees concludes by saying, Now we beseech those that read this book, this document, this account, that they be not discouraged for these calamities, but that they judge those punishments not to be for destruction, but for a chastening of our nation. All right, so that's interesting. If you read the book of 2 Maccabees, it's a really interesting account. So what happened to these godly Jews at this time parallels anything that you've read in Fox's Book of Martyrs about the persecutions of born-again Christians at the hands of the wicked Roman Catholic Church. Now, any Jew in Israel back in those ancient times would have known about this incredible time in their history, and it is very possible, when you think about it, that Paul might have had these things in mind when he wrote Hebrews chapter 11. In verse 35 it says, Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. All right, so Antiochus's men, what they do is they pass through Israel city by city, and they're setting up altars to Zeus. They're compelling the Jews to defile themselves or be killed. And they end up coming to a city of Modin. Antiochus by this time is headed back up to Antioch, and he's left his generals in charge, and there's different Seleucid armies throughout all of Israel and Judea going city by city, commanding people to offer sacrifice to an idol and submit to the Grecian mandates. And so they're going through city by city. They set up an altar to Zeus, and they come to the city of Modin. Now, Modin is slightly north of Jerusalem, midway between Jerusalem and the seacoast. And that was the home of an elderly, godly, Levitical priest named Matthias. Okay, Menelaus is still the wicked high priest there at Jerusalem, helping Menelaus was helping Antiochus Epiphanes persecute his own people. But here at the city of Modin, you have this godly Levitical priest named Matthias. And the soldiers, they selected Matthias to partake of the idol altar first. And it says in the account, it says, Then answered the king's officers and said to Matthias on this wise, Thou art a ruler and an honorable and great man in this city, and strengthened with sons and brethren. Now therefore come thou first, and fulfill the king's commandment, like as all the heathen have done, yea, and the men of Judah also, and such as remain at Jerusalem. So shalt thou and thy house be in the number of the king's friends, and thou and thy children shall be honored with silver and gold and many rewards. Then Matthias answered and spake with a loud voice, Though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him, and fall away every one from the religion of their fathers, and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons and my brethren walk in the covenant of our fathers. God forbid that we should forsake the law and the ordinances, we will not hearken to the king's words to go from our religion, either on the right hand or on the left. So while Matthias is saying all of this and making this bold proclamation, he's standing there, and then behind him, there's this other Jewish guy, that walks up to the altar and takes the swine's flesh sample and off the tray and eats it. And Matthias, while he's giving the speech, sees this, and he becomes so enraged and gets so much indignation and zeal that he runs over and kills the guy. And I don't know how he killed him, but in my mind's eye, I see him running up behind this guy and grabbing him by the head and just turning his head backwards. He's just like, I cannot believe you just forsook the covenant of your fathers for these jokers, So Matthias, after he kills this Jewish guy that had just defiled himself, Matthias then runs over and kills the soldier that's handing out the samples and kicks down the altar. So it's one of those epic moments where everybody's standing by just watching this stunned, and he's just going on a rampage. And with all eyes on Matthias, Matthias shouts, "Whosoever is zealous of the law and maintaineth the covenant, let him follow me." So he and his sons, they flee into the mountains and left all that they ever had in the city. So the Jews start fleeing out of the cities right and left. They start going into the wilderness, and even like the Bible says, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Just because the books of Maccabees aren't scripture doesn't mean that these verses in Hebrews 11 can't apply to them. These verses in Hebrews 11 can apply to these Old Testament Jews just as much as they can to other Old Testament saints, just as much as they can to the Christians in Fox's Book of Martyrs, and just as much as they can to you. The Bible is all-encompassing like that. All right, so once the Jews began fleeing and hiding in the wilderness, Antiochus sent his soldiers to hunt them down and to kill them, and Antiochus' strategy was to gain intel of the Jews' hideouts and to deliberately wait until the Sabbath day to attack. And this worked initially. There were whole groups of Jews who refused to fight because it was the Sabbath day. So Antiochus sent his soldiers and he told them, deliberately wait till the Sabbath day because they'll be resting, and that's when to attack. And there was a lot of Jews that they felt that they were not allowed to fight on the Sabbath, so they just figured that it was the will of God for them to stand by and be killed, which is exactly what happened. They thought that the spiritual thing to do was to die instead of defend yourself and your family. Now the question is, what does God think about that? Now, in the Old Testament, remember we're still in an Old Testament time period, and the Bible doesn't say whether the Jews can or can't fight on the Sabbath or defend themselves, especially if they're under attack. So some would argue, well, it is okay that we defend ourselves on the Sabbath, and some of them would argue, no, it's not okay that we defend ourselves on the Sabbath. But who would be right? Well, one piece of advice that, we have similar issues in our day and age as Christians. Is it right if the government's out to destroy you, to defend yourself? Should you defend yourself? Should you not defend yourself? What's the right thing to do? All right, well, here's one piece of advice that I would give you. When you have a situation that the Bible is not clear on, 100% clear on, and you have to make a decision, defer to what is natural. Because more often than not, God's ways are in accordance with nature because God created nature and God wired you with what is natural, okay? And more often than not, Satan's ways are against nature and unnatural. All right? So that's not an absolute rule. I'm just saying if you are not sure and you have to make a choice and you're uncertain, defer to what's natural because more often than not, you'll be making the right decision. Because here's the thing, standing by and letting your family be killed and your wife be raped by enemy soldiers while you sit there and pray about it is not natural. And if there's any doubt in your mind as to whether this is a situation to suffer or to stand up, lean towards standing up, unless you are absolutely certain that this is specifically persecution that God would have you to endure. You say, well, okay, then did these Jews do the right thing? They were killed specifically for their religion and worship of God, so wasn't standing down the right thing to do? These Jews who were attacked on the Sabbath, who'd refused to defend themselves and just allowed themselves to be killed, wasn't that the right thing to do? Well, 10 different people could debate it 10 different ways, but my answer would be this, and you may or may not agree with me, and that's fine. But the choice to defend yourself or not defend yourself in a persecution scenario is not a moral issue. It's not a moral issue, okay? That is, God gives you the choice. I mean, the choice could be different depending on the specifics of the situation. You could choose to suffer for God's sake, and if you do, God will bless you with a reward. Or you can choose to defend yourself, and perhaps God will bless you with deliverance. And Christian history has examples of both in it. If you've never read about the Waldensians and their defense against the Roman Catholic Church, you ought to read that sometime. I personally don't believe that it's not. Okay, let me just restart. I don't. How do I have this written? I have this written backwards here. Anyway, I believe that it's not a sin if you do defend yourself, and it's not a sin if you don't defend yourself, because it's not a moral issue, okay? At least when it's just yourself, okay? When you start adding a wife and kids into the equation, now the moral constraint to protect them or let them get hurt, because that is your God-given prerogative to defend your family and to protect them, now it does start to become a moral issue. But if you're just dealing with yourself, if it's just you, whether you lay down your life or defend yourself, either way, it's not a moral issue. You can take your choice, and God might deliver you if you defend yourself, or God could give you a reward. By the way, if you defend yourself and you get killed, it's still persecution. You're still killed for your faith. So anyway, now I know there's a lot of debate on this. I have to be careful not to go too in-depth on this right now, because that's not what this is all about. But part of my rationale for my answer is due to this. Is due to the fact that Matthias and his family heard about these Sabbath day slaughters, and Matthias and his family had to decide while they were hiding if this was something that they were going to allow to happen to themselves or not, because inevitably, sooner or later, they were going to be faced with the same dilemma. Sooner or later, the Seleucid army would find them on a Sabbath day, and they would have to decide if they're going to fight or just allow themselves to be killed. And you can understand the theological arguments that were going on at that time, and here's what they decided. 2 Maccabees 2:40 says, "And one of them said to another, If we all do as our brethren have done, and fight not for our lives and the lives and laws against the heathen, they, the heathen, will now quickly root us out of the earth." And I'm wrapping up, just so you know. "At this time, therefore, they decreed," this is Matthias and his family, "they decreed, saying, Whosoever shall come to make battle with us on the Sabbath day, we will fight against him. Neither will we die all as our brethren that were murdered in the secret places." So they decided to take a stand. They decided to be a man. They decided to take a stand and defend themselves and their loved ones, even if it was the government. So the question is, where do you stand? What are your thoughts on this issue? Unfortunately, the world came to a kind of a close call with some of these issues in the last couple years, especially in places like Australia and New Zealand. And it's very possible that we could be faced with this same dilemma again. What is your opinion on it? I heard one preacher say you're just supposed to bend over and take it from the government. But the question is that what God really wants you to do? Is that what you're supposed to do? In my opinion, that preacher's statement is a load of crap. But that's my opinion, and you don't have to agree with me. As you will see very clearly next week, God was most certainly with Matthias. Matthias chose to not stand by and let him and his family and his wife be raped and his kids killed, because that's what was going on. He decided he was going to take a stand against the government. And God was obviously with Matthias, and they did exploits through the strength and power of God. And it will be evidenced through the exploits of the next character we'll hear about next week, Judas Maccabeus. So I realize some of these issues are difficult issues. I cover a lot of this in detail in the lessons that I did on human rights and the Bible, and also the series of lessons on vertical, horizontal, and inverted. But I encourage you, Christian, to think for yourself. There's a lot of different opinions on this matter, and we've been able to take these things for granted for a long time in America with the freedom and liberty that we have. But you better start thinking about these things and decide beforehand where you stand. Because, God forbid, we might be put to the test. So God bless you. Have a good week.